Hello everybody, Dan Alasso here, and it's almost the new year and I am preparing for my courses for the spring semester. I'll be teaching an ancient world history and I'll also be teaching US History 1 and a couple of other things. But those are the two that I'm really preparing right at the moment. And one of the things that I decided to do as I'm preparing for the US History 1 is I decided to listen to a US history, the History of the United States, second edition, from the Great Courses. I saw this in the used bookstore today while I was waiting for them to total up the value of the books that I had brought in to sell to them that I didn't need on my shelves. And as I was just looking through the history section, I found this. The Great Courses, of course, are a series of audio sets like this. This one was numbered 8,500. I don't know if there are actually 8,500 of them or it just has to do with their numbering scheme. But in any case, this is a course on the history of the United States. 3 professors basically wrote it. Alan C. Guelzo, who was a professor of American history at Eastern University, Gary W. Gallagher, professor of history and of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia, and Patrick N. Allitt, professor of history at Emory University. And so, of course, I want my U.S. history course to be a great course as well. And so I thought I would listen to these and try to get some inspiration and maybe even some pointers, either on content or on form or presentation or whatever I can pick up as I do this. So I listened to the first lecture in the series today, and that was chapter 1 of, it looks like, 84 chapters. So there's quite a bit of material in here. I'm not sure if all of it is in here or just the U.S. History 1 part of it in these 7 boxes. But I'll let you know. The first lecture was called Living Bravely, and it was by Professor Alan Guelzo. And I think he was the organizer of the whole thing, so it's appropriate that he's sort of the first to lecture in this series. And Professor Guelzo gave a slightly over half-hour lecture, and I'm going to tell you about the notes that I made on it. He began with an introduction, and I should say that I expect each of these great courses episodes is going to begin with the well-known fanfare, da 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 da. So I'll be hearing that quite a bit. And actually it also began with applause as he introduced himself. So apparently he gave this lecture, or at least read this script, in front of people, or they want us to imagine that he did. And so he began with a short introduction that talked about some of the themes that they were going to focus on in this American history. And the first of them was, he said, an American passion for freedom. He said that this is sometimes expressed as an American passion for democracy, but the idea of self-rule. And then he elaborated and said the next very important thing for Americans is that we value the pursuit of education, and that this is very important to create a situation in which we can actually make something of ourselves. And then he went on to say that we have an unassailable or unchallenged faith in the value of popular government, again, democracy. And he talked about the willingness of Americans to experiment and to try new ideas, politically, socially, economically. And an example of this that he gave was that historically we've been very able to assimilate immigrants and to welcome foreigners. Now that's an interesting claim to make, and I'll be interested to see what he does with that claim as we move forward. And then the final one, and I was wondering whether he was going to address this, and he really jumped right into it with both feet. Professor Guelzo claimed that the most important element of America and of our identity is this uniqueness, this exceptionality, and the fact that we believe, and he also apparently believes, that we are an example to the world. So we are an exemplary civilization. We are, he said, a city upon a hill. So he's not challenging the idea of American exceptionalism. He is kind of jumping into it with both feet. So that is going to be interesting to see how he develops that as well going forward. So this lecture was actually broken on the CD into 5 sections. lettered A through F. And in part B, he began to expand on that idea of exceptionalism. And he did admit that this idea that we have of our exceptionalism can sometimes degenerate into smugness, and that people don't like that. Other people in the world, other nations don't necessarily appreciate that. But he insisted that mostly it imparts on us a sense of some type of national mission. He went back to the idea of this passion for freedom that Americans have, and he said that this distinguishes us from Europeans. And then he introduces Columbus as an entrepreneur, which is an interesting concept. Before telling Columbus's story, he talks a little bit about the Indians. He said that historians are not really 100% sure where Indians came from. He says the conventional wisdom, and he uses that term, is that there was a land bridge in the Bering Strait. And of course, I have a lot to say about Beringia and the idea that it really wasn't a bridge. And so that's a point upon which we differ, and people will see my answer to that question in my course. On the other hand, Professor Guelzo says Native Americans resist this idea, and most Indian people don't want to believe that they are ultimately from somewhere else. And he uses the example of Kennewick Man, which when this series was made, I assume it was made in the 1990s, was a little bit of a problem for people trying to piece together ancient American origins. Kennewick Man was carbon dated to about 8,000 or 9,000 years old, but morphologically, the skeleton seemed to be very different from what people were expecting of an 8,000 or 9,000 year old Paleo-Indian skeleton. And so there was some controversy about whether this human may have been more like a European somehow. Subsequently, there's been a full genomic analysis of Kennewick Man, and it turns out that his DNA is very much like the Beringian ancestors of Native Americans. So morphology doesn't always tell the whole story. But it is an interesting example of how controversy works when we're talking about ancient origins. He talks about the rapid population growth of the New World, and he says that by 1500, the population was probably 10 or 15 million. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the population of the Americas when Europeans arrived. And 10 or 15 million is really on the low side of what the consensus estimate seems to be at this point for the entirety of the two continents. 10 or 15 million might actually be an appropriate number for just North America itself, but the Incan Empire seems to have had 11 to 15 million people, and there were probably about 25 million people living in the Valley of Mexico, where the Aztec Empire was, and there were several million living in the Caribbean. So the probable total in the Americas at the time of first contact with Europeans was probably something like 60 or 65 million, which is not that unlike the total population of Europe or of Africa at the time. Of course, India and China both had populations of over 100 million in 1500. So the bulk of world population has always been in Asia. But the point is that the actual population of North and South America at first contact was probably equivalent to the population of Europe. Now, Professor Guelzo does say that there was a lot of complexity and variation in the Americas. And he also admits that Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital that later became Mexico City, and which had a population of over 200,000, was possibly the largest city in the world at that time. In the next segment, the professor goes back to Europe and gives us a snapshot of around the year 1200. And he says that in a lot of ways, Europe was very much like America at that time. And he talks about the breakup of the Roman Empire and kind of the social and economic collapse in Western Europe that resulted from that. He talks about the rise of Islam and says that Islam, in his words, overran much of Southern Europe and the Mediterranean and really made Europe what he calls a backwater. And then he says that in 1096, this began to be reversed when Pope Urban II called for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Now, this was successful. The Crusaders did capture Jerusalem and massacre everybody who lived in the city, but then the Muslims ultimately took it back less than a century later. So this crusade and the gains of this crusade were short-lived. But he says the Crusades did teach Europeans how to do this sort of organized campaigning warfare outside of their own territories. One of the things that he doesn't talk about, that I tend to focus more on, is that the Spaniards and the Portuguese had done the same thing in the Iberian Peninsula in what they called the Reconquista, which was a war against the Muslim occupiers that lasted over 700 years and taught them a lot about the warrior culture and about social and political forms like the encomienda that they would then transplant to the New World. Professor Guelzo also doesn't mention sugar, which the Crusaders discovered in Palestine during the First Crusade and brought back to their own territory and began sugar cultivation and processing in places like the Canary Islands and Sao Tome off the coast of Africa, and of course began utilizing African slaves in order to do that. He then talks about the lure of what he calls the Orient and begins to tell a story about 1271 when the Venetian Marco Polo traveled with his father and his uncle to China and spent 3 years in the court of the Emperor Kublai Khan, and then came back to Europe and wrote about it. And this was very motivational to a lot of people. Columbus is known to have read the travels of Marco Polo and been very inspired by it. In the next segment, Professor Guelzo talks about how the Italians, and especially the Venetians and the Genoese, became very wealthy in this trade with the East. And then he says the Genoese also accidentally brought back the plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, from the Black Sea in one of their trading missions. And this is true, and it was very traumatic for Europe. Possibly half of the European population was wiped out between 1347 and the early years of the 1350s. He then says that the Mediterranean really controlled, and the Genoese and the Venetians really sort of controlled access to what he calls Palestine, and that the Western Europeans, if they wanted to get in the game, had to invent a new set of rules. And he begins the discussion of this by saying that the Portuguese, under the inspiration of Prince Henry the Navigator, found a southern route around the bottom of Africa in 1488. And then he continues by saying that Vasco da Gama, quote, avoided the middlemen and sailed a fleet directly to India, and then brought back profits in a range of 600% to his investors. And then he returns to that entrepreneur, Columbus, the Genoese, who went to Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain and invited them to get in the game as well. Now, Professor Guelzo does say that the Azores and the Canary Islands had been lost to human memory. And I think that's not really entirely accurate. Possibly during the medieval era, but certainly well before the time of Columbus sailing west across the Atlantic, the Portuguese were all over these islands off the African coast. They had finished their reconquest of Portugal and taking it back from the Muslims in 1415. And then they had spent the majority of the 15th century exploring the coast. That's how they had managed to get control of the Azores and begin raising sugar there, and in other islands like Sao Tome. And the Spanish actually started raising sugar in the Canary Islands as well. Now, the professor does mention that Washington Irving's story about how Columbus was the only person to believe that the world wasn't flat was just wildly incorrect and made up, which is good because he's right about that. And then in the final segment, he kind of weirdly says that the Portuguese and the Spanish were sort of upset about the discovery of the Americas because they thought of these two continents and all of the islands in the Caribbean as a barrier to Asia. And he goes on to say that the Spanish were not glad to discover the Americas, which is incorrect and also kind of weird, almost as if he's trying to find a way to justify the Dutch and the English, the Protestants later, from coming and taking North America away from the Spanish. I don't know. He does talk about Magellan and Balboa and Vespucci and Verrazano and Martin Frobisher, all of whom were, in fact, looking for a northwest passage, a way to get through North and South America, or around North and South America, and continue on to Asia. But these people were navigators, and of course that was their job. That doesn't mean that at the same time there weren't people very actively thinking about taking advantage of what they had found in the New World. From very early on in the Caribbean, the Spanish had tried to enslave the native peoples and put them to work. Columbus, the very first time that he returned after his report to Ferdinand and Isabella, came with 17 ships and over 1,000 men, and grapevines and seeds of all kinds of European plants that they thought would grow well in these Caribbean islands, and sugar. So this begins in 1493. And that doesn't support his claim that it really wasn't the European governments who were that interested in exploiting this new world, but what he called individual freebooters, who were more interested in taking advantage of this opportunity. He talks about Cortez. He talks about Pizarro. And certainly Cortez did exceed his orders when he burned his ships and marched into the Valley of Mexico and overthrew Moctezuma. But I think this is a weird kind of distinction to try to make between the actions of governments and the actions of freebooters or individuals or entrepreneurs. Ultimately, the Spanish Empire collected most of the gold and especially the silver that was mined in places like Zacatecas in Mexico and Potosi in Peru. So I'm a little bit resistant to Professor Guelzo's idea that traditional European rules were kind of suspended and that people could, quote, live bravely in the Americas without the restraint that they would have felt back in the Old World. He does mention, actually, that in Hispaniola, in 1496, there were 1.1 million natives, and 50 years later, there were only 200 left alive. And he says that partially this was because the Spanish were so brutal to their new Indian subjects, but that mostly it was because of disease. He doesn't spend a lot of time talking about really the impact on native societies or native culture of what we now call the Columbian Exchange. And in fact, he moves kind of directly on to this question of, does all this make Columbus a criminal? Which he asks at this point. And this is very close to the end of the final segment of this lecture to be bringing this up. So he kind of races through it, and ultimately he concludes that the consequences of the invasion were, in fact, horrible, but that's kind of beside the point. And where he sort of ends is by saying that a lot of American history, or a lot of the way he's going to tell American history, is going to be about this kind of what he calls irony. When, in his words, consequences wholly unlike what the people had planned actually happened. So I don't know, I guess we'll see if that is going to be a suggestion that a lot of the horror of the American history that he's going to narrate here is going to be explained as unintended consequences, which, if that is the case, I might have to have something to say about. But that is the first chapter of the Great Courses History of the United States, 2nd edition. And I will be going through at least the part of this that corresponds with my U.S. History 1 course this semester, which is the pre-Columbian period to the end of the Civil War. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.